Okay, welcome everybody to today's Regtalks, the podcast where tax and trade regulations come together. I'm Barry Larking, and I'm with my old friend Philip Baker, who is not only an English King's Counsel, but also a professor of tax at Oxford University. Welcome, Philip.
Hello, Barry. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Now, let me introduce the topic. We've been used to the OECD running the International Tax Show. But now the United Nations, the UN, has stepped in with two initiatives. First, a framework convention on tax, and second, a fast-track instrument on tax treaties. Now, in a nutshell, Philip, if that's not asking the impossible, what are these two proposals about? And can you give us some insights into what kind of rules we're talking about?
Okay, let me start with the fast track instrument because that's something I worked on. That's a product of the UN Committee of Experts on Tax Cooperation, which actually is a committee that goes back historically back to the 1970s, but it's been a permanent committee since the early 2000s. And that's designed to be a multilateral convention for rapidly implementing changes to existing tax treaties, bilateral tax treaties, in order to reflect recent changes to the UN model. It's to streamline the updating of tax treaties with developing countries. The Framework Convention is a much larger undertaking. It's going to take 3 years to draft. There's a drafting committee working on it. They have to come back in the latter part of 2027, and that's to introduce a framework within the UN for intergovernmental cooperation. Plus, it's also going to have two early protocols dealing with two proposals on two specific topics. So, in a nutshell, those are the two proposals.
Okay, so that gives us like the framework. The fast track instrument is living up to its name then and is going to be the faster of the two, if I've understood you correctly. That's going to be introduced earlier, and that's going to introduce some tax treaty changes. What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, firstly, the time scale on it is a little difficult to say because it is fully drafted. It needs a little bit of tweaking, but it's been approved by the UN Economic and Social Council about a month ago, and they've drawn it to the attention of interested countries, and it's now for countries to take it on. If there is a sufficient number of countries to take it on, then it could move pretty fast because it is, in the words of our former UK Prime Minister, it is an oven-ready agreement. There would need to be some form of conference of potential parties to agree the text, and then, lo and behold, it flows on. And it's designed to introduce changes that the UN Committee of Experts have made in the last couple of years to the UN model. Let me highlight one particular one, which is very interesting, and that is the UN subject to tax rule. There are two subject to tax rules floating around. There's an OECD draft, which is almost incomprehensible, and there is a UN draft, which is very easy to understand. And the idea is that developing countries have entered into tax treaties under which they reduce their withholding tax on, for example, interest, on the assumption that the interest will then be taxed in the country of residence. But that's not always happening. Sometimes the country of residence is not imposing tax, and so the developing country is needlessly reducing its tax take. And some very interesting figures came out actually yesterday from the South Centre and the G24, calculating how much more revenue developing countries would be collecting if they had this UN subject to tax rule. And that's one of the implementations that the FTI can be used for. And because I think that people now recognize how useful this subject to tax rule would be, I think that's going to give an impetus to the FTI to move forward pretty fast. I've got in my calendar that I'd rather like to see the FTI actually being adopted by the ECOSOC meeting next March in New York.
Right, but if they adopt it, then that doesn't mean that all countries are going to be on board, does it? It's like first adopt it, and then at central level, if I can call it that, and then countries will have to sign on to it. Or have I understood that correctly?
No, you're absolutely correct. Actually, nothing is being done that countries don't have to agree to, but the actual FTI itself is commitment light. There is virtually no reason why a government should not sign up to the FTI and then participate in the process, and then they can decide what changes they want to make or what they don't make. It's a bit like an invitation to a party, and people are told there'll be wine and there'll be dancing. But it's up to you whether you take part in the wine or the dancing. It's forming a framework. My hope is that once the framework is in place, countries will find this a much more efficient way of speedily updating their treaties with developing countries to give them revenue which they badly need and which, quite frankly, is at the moment creating situations of double non-taxation or under-taxation. I can't actually see any good reason why any country should say, no, we're not going to participate. I mean, I don't anticipate the US participating, but then it hasn't got many treaties with developing countries. But any other reasonable country within the UN, I cannot see a reason why it would not participate.
Well, let me pick up on that point, Philip, because I mean, I agree with you in principle. It sounds, why would you not agree? On the other hand, these are proposals. The changes that they're proposing are already enshrined, if you like, in the existing UN Model Tax Treaty. So why, if countries haven't already adopted those rules, even if they're not, part of the UN conversation, why are they more likely to sign up to the FTI?
The problem for developing countries is that if they want to try to amend an existing treaty to include any of these new UN provisions, it kind of opens up a potential Pandora's box. They could end up with a whole renegotiation. Plus, also, they are often not high on the agenda of treaty negotiation teams for other countries. They're often limited amount of trade. They're important for the developing country, not so important for the developed country. This, first of all, limits the changes that can be made. It doesn't open up the treaty for a whole renegotiation. It provides existing wording. There's very little negotiation that has to go on. And it provides a setting in which developing countries could, for example, approach a country en masse as a whole group saying, all of us have this issue with our treaty
Yeah.
and we'd like to have it amended. And the subject to tax rule is a great example where I think it's very hard to justify keeping withholding taxes in developing countries low if there is no comparable taxation in the residence country. I think the principle is agreed. This is now a methodology. It's a new way of updating treaties. We've never done this before, but I think it may become the method of preference. You may have an OECD approach that also follows this in future years if it proves to be very helpful in terms of using limited resources in treaty teams to make desirable changes very rapidly. But we have to sort of wait to see how it goes.
Yeah, of course. So I know in a way what you're saying is the process that we've been used to in negotiating tax treaties, generally speaking, bilateral, that involves a lot of horse trading. If you accept this, then we'll give up that, and so on. That won't be the hurdle that it normally is under this system.
Well, you could have a degree of horse trading because there's more than one change that's covered by the
Okay,
FTI. I've
okay.
highlighted the subject to tax, but there are, for example, provisions with regard to covering pension funds. There are provisions with regard to the cross-border taxation of services. There are
Hmm.
provisions with regard to arbitration. So it is possible for a country to say, we're prepared to accept the subject to tax rule if you also accept the provision with regard to pensions. But what it doesn't do is to sort of open up the whole can of worms to say, yeah, but we'd like to have a change to the dividend article, and we want to have a change to the non-discrimination, and then you end up with a
Yeah, yeah,
whole series. You can
clear.
trade off within the scope of the FTI, but you don't open up a whole can of
Can of
worms.
worms. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so that's the FTI. What about the Framework Convention?
Well, this is interesting because it's been coming for a number of years. 20 years or so ago, developing countries already said that they needed a wider forum for negotiation of international tax cooperation outside of the OECD. This has all moved quite fast. 2023, the UN General Assembly, not ECOSOC, the General Assembly adopt a resolution for the Secretary General to come forward with a proposal, came up with a proposal of a framework convention last year. Terms of reference were drafted. This year, a drafting committee was set up, and they've got until the end of 2027. This has sort of, in a sense, two elements to it. One element is the framework convention itself, which would have it would establish an institution, a conference of the parties, which could discuss international tax cooperation. The other element are the protocols, and there are two early protocols that are being drafted in this 3 year process. One of them dealing with cross-border taxation and cross-border services in a digitalized economy, and the other one dealing with dispute resolution and prevention. We now know that there are three work streams established, and there are some initial discussion documents about these work streams. My personal view is I'm rather pessimistic about the Framework Convention. The discussions last year showed a deep divide between what one might loosely call the Global South and the Global North being OECD plus EU countries. And at the moment, unless there's rather more willingness to compromise, I don't see the Global North countries joining in to this process. So we may end up with 120 global South countries. There will be a framework convention. The more that they try to draft into it binding commitments, which I think is the mistake, the more that countries will say, we're not prepared to sign up to something which is effectively a blank check. We don't know what we're signing up to. The two protocols, well, we have yet to see exactly what they're going to contain, and also whether they will be open to countries that have not signed up the Framework Convention.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the digital services tax type of levy, the tax on automated digital services. Um, I mean, there's a lot of discussion now and movement. The EU has just effectively said that it's going to not push for these digital services taxes. Isn't this kind of going in the opposite direction then? If one of the key pillars of to use a term, um, if the general trend is away from this kind of tax, if the Framework Convention is going to precisely focus on that tax.
This is a much broader proposal, not just digital service taxes, but a tax on all cross-border services, including intra-group services, by a gross withholding tax on the payments. And it's a recognition that for developing countries, frankly, that's one of the few ways that they're going to effectively raise significant amounts of revenue. It looks to me as though they are working towards the development of the first early protocol around Article 12AA, as it's now called, of the UN
Mhm.
model, which is a generalized cross-border withholding tax on services. Now, is that running against the views of the US government? Absolutely. The US is dead opposed to digital service taxes and therefore will be opposed to this. And the US walked out of the Framework Convention. I don't think anybody is crying about the fact they moved out. I don't think anybody expected the US ever to buy into this.
Mhm.
But it's not just the US, I think, that are uncomfortable with it. A number of other countries voted against the Framework Convention in the terms of reference committee. I don't see the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Argentina. These are countries that are not going to sign up to it. If you don't have those countries accepting a withholding tax on services. I mean, a country can introduce a withholding tax on services. That may or may not conflict with existing tax treaties.
Mhm.
There, the only, I mean, the real question, I guess, is it going to prompt a retaliation from the US?
Well, we know what
And
happened. It was happened before. Then the answer is yes.
well, it may or may not. I mean, if it's a UN proposal and it's large and it's being widely
Yeah,
adopted domestically by a large number of developing countries, I mean, is the US
yeah,
going
yeah.
to retaliate? By the time this is approved, hopefully we've seen the end of the Trump administration. I mean, we're not looking at this to being drafted until the end of 2027, opened for signature at the earliest in 2028. I mean, if Trump sticks to the US Constitution, he will be retiring to Mar-a-Lago and playing golf for the rest of his life if he is, well, yeah, assuming that he's not somewhere else at the pleasure of
Well,
the
yes.
US
Well,
state. Mm.
um, yeah. Okay. I mean, I take your point because the retaliation that we had before was against the domestic, if you like, sort of the single digital services taxes that were being introduced around, which is easier, obviously, for the US to retaliate against. But I take your point. If a
Yeah.
big enough bloc is putting this forward, maybe it's more difficult. Oh, but just one question: BEPS. What does the Framework Convention say about the BEPS rules, in particular, obviously, the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2
This has
proposals?
been, well, this has been one of the very difficult issues in the negotiations because the global North countries want the UN developments to, in a sense, respect agreements that have already been reached, including those
Hmm.
through the BEPS 1.0 proposal and BEPS 2.0. They're the two pillar proposals. The global South countries, many of them are saying, look, we didn't actually sign up to these. We weren't participating in the negotiating processes there, and we think everything should be on the table. And that's one of the elements of clear disagreement, how far work being carried out in other fora, which is a sort of code word for what the OECD has done, should or should not be respected. So far as Pillar 2 is concerned, sorry, as far as BEPS 2.0 is concerned, I mean, Pillar 1 is, I think, pretty much everyone accepts that that's dead there. So we're not actually going to have to worry about this conflicting or Pillar 1 just isn't going anywhere. Pillar 2
But
at the
but you do
moment
but you do
is
sorry to interrupt, Philip, just for clarity, but the Framework Convention would include a kind of quasi Pillar 1 proposal.
it would include potentially arrangements for reallocation of taxing rights, which is
Hmm.
what Pillar One was all about, but
Yeah.
it would not necessarily reflect in any way the same approach to Pillar One. I mean,
Okay.
Pillar One essentially was stillborn at the beginning because it required two things. It required a multilateral convention and it required the US to be
Yeah.
on board because it
Yeah.
was, as it developed, primarily the largest number of companies that would be involved, or multinational groups, would be US groups. Not having the US on board, which was foreseeable from the beginning, meant that it was never going to fly. And what's really quite surprising is that the OECD could have spent so much time on something which was never going to fly. I mean, there's big question marks about why that was done. In any project that has failed, there may well be components that have been developed that are useful and that take the discussion forward. And I shouldn't be totally critical of the work at the OECD because they may well have identified things like, for example, sourcing rules for services that digital services that actually prove very useful.
Yeah.
But I don't see that the first UN protocol is going to look in any way like Pillar One,
Okay.
subject to the fact that it will also be giving a taxing right to the
Yeah.
market jurisdiction of the country
Okay. Which is
where the
obviously
users
good.
are.
Yeah, which is obviously good news for the developing countries.
Yeah.
Very quickly, Pillar Two. What does the Framework Convention say about that? Is there an equivalent
Well,
Pillar
it
Two?
doesn't actually deal with the same topic as Pillar Two at all. Pillar Two is concerned with a global corporate minimum tax, and that is not something that is being covered in any of the two early protocols. Whether the framework convention itself will contain some sort of commitment to a global minimum tax. But as Pillar Two is running into tremendous difficulties at the moment with the US effectively sticking to its guilty rules, which
Yeah.
are different in very significant ways from the Pillar Two proposal that come out of the OECD. It is by no means certain that there won't be some sort of postponement of Pillar Two around the world. We're yet to hear what this G7 agreement for the side by side, separate but equal proposals where the US is guilty in many ways, and the rest of the world has, not even the rest of the world. I mean, the number of countries that have signed up and actually implemented Pillar Two legislation is relatively few. And one of the things we're yet to see is how far the US has asked for special treatment on the global minimum tax. Do we anticipate that China, India, Brazil, they're going
Mm.
to ask for special treatment as well? I don't see any reason why they wouldn't
Yeah.
there. I mean, might say it might be said, well, you don't have the equivalent of guilty, and if you
Well,
had, then it'd be
yeah.
hard to deny special
Yeah,
treatment.
well, I'm sure they could introduce that if at the last minute if they wanted to. But I guess, I mean, your point I think you made earlier about it's a framework convention and it has this sort of possibility for a lot of protocols to sort of to put flesh on the skeleton, if I can call it that. So I guess it's anybody's guess whether something like Pillar Two would end up as part of the convention, and it doesn't mean that the convention then doesn't get adopted. If I've understood correctly, the convention would get adopted, and then it would be up to countries to decide what kind of protocols do we want to include in it, and that's a sort of an ongoing process. Is that more or
Well,
less?
yes and no, actually. It's anyone's guess whether there will ever be more protocols than these first two
Oh,
protocols.
oh,
It's
okay.
clear that, at least with regard to the first protocol, that's what is the immediate concern of some of the global south countries. It may
Yeah.
be that after this 3-year process has gone through, countries are so fed up with the process that they say, oh my God, we do not want to consider ever again any more protocols. Or countries may say, hey, this is a great idea. We've got this conference of the parties. It's going to meet once a year at least. We've got to start working on some new protocols, but and then there are some very important topics that were not voted in favor for those protocols. I mean, other candidates included illicit financial flows, which are a very important topic for developing countries, and taxation of high net wealth individuals, again, a very important topic. So there are subjects there, but it's the question of whether the process is going to, I mean, I really pity government representatives who are going to have to spend the next 3 years at this appalling process. I think they deserve bonuses for having to go along and spend. I mean, they're going to spend 2 weeks in New York in August. I mean, that itself, they should be paid sort of danger money for doing that. And that's going to go on. There are going to be meetings in Nairobi and in New York for the next 3 years. I'm not going to comment about the secretariat or the chair of the meetings, but you're going to need to have somebody with the wisdom of Solomon who's going to be able to bring this home. My own view is that the mistake was made right at the beginning, and it was an NGO-induced mistake of adopting a framework convention. They should have looked at something much more like the FTI, which was commitment light, and was simply establishing a simple method for people to for countries to get together, instead of which they took a leaf out of the climate change convention, and that required governments to make upfront commitments. Now, what sensible government is going to sign up to a long-term commitment to a fair allocation of international taxing rights when they've got no idea what that actually means in practice or what they're signing up to there. And I think those were mistakes that were made right at the very beginning. The form of a framework convention was wrong. You may well ask me what would have been the alternative. Well, back in the 1940s and early 50s, there was a UN Fiscal Commission, which unfortunately was wound up in 1954. There's a lot to be said for what the UN should have been doing, was to resuscitate that commission and then let it develop its own agenda. Absolutely no commitments in creating it. It would have been the intergovernmental body. And I should also point out very quickly that the UN Committee of Experts on Tax Cooperation, the separate committee that's been existing for years, a new committee, the membership of that should be announced almost as we're speaking. They're supposed to have taken office since the 1st of July this year. They will be meeting in Geneva in October. They will determine their agenda for the next 4 years. And in terms of what to watch, that committee, the last 4-year term of that committee, proved to be highly productive in terms of what came out from it. The next committee could be equally productive, and I'd be very interested to watch how that committee through the UN, how it develops over the next 4 years.
Great. Well, thanks, Philip. I mean, I was just about to ask you what should we be looking for in the next 12 to 24 months, but I think you've given us a good insight into that. Now we're running very rapidly out of time. We've had a number of questions. We're not going to be able to deal with all of them, so watch our channels, and we'll do our best to get back to you on those. But there's one question I think that I did rather like see coming in. Because I think that sums up the essential problematic with this whole procedure. If the UN takes over the OECD's role, isn't that simply going to get the pendulum swinging back from the developing countries to the from the developed countries to the developing countries? In other words, is it going to solve anything? Is it really going to make these rules more inclusive in the sense that everybody is on board and not just that those who have currently been excluded are then included? What's your view on that?
Well, there's no question, I think, of taking over from the OECD. The OECD is not about to shut up shop and stop dealing with tax matters there. And they do have the inclusive framework, and they do act as secretariat for a number of other important international fora, like the Forum of Exchange of Information, the Forum on VAT, and the whole discussions on carbon taxation. So the UN is always going to have to work alongside the OECD, and they need to develop a balance between the two. As to the UN itself, I am pessimistic as to whether the Framework Convention will actually ever really take off. As I say, it will be drafted, I would guess, about 120 countries, but I don't think at the moment that the Global North countries will join that. And an international body that doesn't have the Global North is not going to be truly representative there. The Committee of Experts, I emphasize again, that does have representation from around the world. The experts are government specialists. They're not completely independent as such. They're notionally there in their personal capacity, and that does represent all countries. So I don't think we're going to see a shift. Worst option, we end up with two parallel international tax discourses. The Global North holds their meetings through the OECD, the Global South through the UN Framework Convention. Neither party follows the proposals that come out from the other, and we're stymied, and we don't have a true multilateral process.
Inclusive.
Truly inclusive, in which case several people are saying, well, what may come about instead is an element of regionalism. The European Union is doing this already to a certain extent. In Africa, ATAF, the African Tax Administration Forum, they are coming out with proposals. There's a Latin American cooperation on tax matters. There may be something like a Commonwealth cooperation on tax matters. And rather than trying to get everybody signed up, which is so difficult with such different tax systems, there will be an element of regional developments where tax systems and problems are relatively similar. The European Union, there's a certain element of similarity. Africa, some countries the countries have mostly similar issues, and we'll go through a period of regional developments rather than a single international body dealing with tax cooperation.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Philip. I think that sums it up nicely. And that's also a wrap for today's Reg Talks. Thank you, Philip. My sincere thanks. As always, a voice of clarity in an increasingly complex international tax world. And thanks also to our viewers. And as always, stay curious, stay critical, and above all, stay with Reg Talks. Thank you.
Thanks, Barry. Nice talking to you. Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.